as far as treatment is concerned, resistance has been a major problem throughout the world as people have treated with one particular miticide only.
Yeah, well, hang on a second. Let me explain this. Beekeepers have been very successful in selective breeding programs, breeding to select for resistant mites. How's that?
Yeah. Well,
they could have avoided that.
Yeah. Well, Australia's got the opportunity to avoid that. So what would you suggest that we do?
You need to rotate treatments. You can't just keep using the same treatment over and over again, or that's just selectively breeding for resistant mites. That's the mistake that's been made in most countries.
Okay. Yeah.
So we rotate in our operation 3 different modes of action. We use oxalic acid, formic acid, and thymol in rotation. And it's very unlikely any mice will be able to evolve resistance to that. Now, you can also rotate with the synthetic miticides also.
A brood break is often a very useful tool in managing mite levels, and particularly in North America, of course, you get a natural one during the winter. But here in Australia, we probably have warmer winters that aren't going to give us a brood break. So do you think we should change our treatment strategy based on that?
Oh, absolutely. Don't think that North America that everybody gets a brood break. That's not the fact at all. No, much of California doesn't get any brood break. Much of the South does not get a brood break. We only get a brood break halfway up North America. Everybody else does not get a brood break. So the conditions are very similar to what's in Australia. I've spent a fair amount of time in Australia, and it's going to be more like Southern California beekeeping.
Right. So we should just emulate the sort of strategies that you're using and the sort of frequencies of treatment that you're using. I think I saw on your website.
You'll typically need to have, if you don't have a brood break, it's typically 4 treatments a year. You're going to need to reduce the mite population somewhere on an average 90%, 4 times a year.
Okay. There's been some very interesting publications coming out of New Zealand, which showed that during the invasion of Varroa, they had an acute phase when the feral colonies were collapsing and beekeepers who weren't treating were producing mite bombs. And that meant that it was a very difficult period for several years while these mite incursions occurred into people's hives. And later on, it then settled down to a more stable chronic phase. But obviously Australia is about to go through this acute phase. What should we be doing during that period in order to sustain us through to when we get to the more chronic phase?
It's going to be tough. We went through the same thing. So while the feral population is collapsing and many beekeepers are not going to properly manage their mites, and they're going to not only go out of business, but they're going to hurt everybody else also. And it's unfortunate, but that's going to be the reality. So it will be more difficult. You may have to do multiple treatments throughout the season during that time. Understand that the bees drift from hive to hive all the time. So there's always transports of mites between the hives by a process of diffusion. And diffusion always goes from a region of high concentration to low concentration, which means that the high mite hives are going to always be drifting to the increasing the population in the low mite hives. The other thing is the robbing at collapse, and that depends upon your climate. In Mediterranean climates, there normally is not robbing at collapse unless there is a honey flow on at the time of collapse, nectar flow on. In most Mediterranean climates, collapse comes well after the nectar flow. The honey's already been ripened, and you don't get much robbing at Varroa collapse. So it's going to be dependent upon that. So if robbing if they collapse while there's nectar flow on, then there's also a lot of mite transfer at that time too.
Now, Randy, you've done a lot of work on extended release use of both thymol and oxalic acid, and the methods you're recommending are clearly superior to the short-term administration as recommended on the labels of these commercial products. So I know you've been working to get these these methods accepted by the EPA. Here we're regulated by the APVMA, and I'd like to know if you can recommend some strategies we might use to persuade them that we should be moving to these extended uses.
Okay. Well, one thing that I did here in the United States with the EPA, I read the law. The law that authorizes them to do things. And I noticed in the law that when it came to unregistered pesticides, the use of unregistered pesticides, that their mandate was not that they shall regulate them, but they may regulate them if necessary to prevent unreasonable risk to the environment. Well, since the natural miticides, the organic acids and thyme oil, are of no unreasonable risk to the environment whatsoever, that means they did not have the mandate to regulate them. So I sent them a letter in July to clarify that my interpretation, or the beekeeper's interpretation, was that they didn't have authority to regulate them. And we just had a meeting, and they agreed with us. They do not have authority to do that. So beekeepers are free, as far as the EPA is concerned, to use generic treatments off the shelf. You can't advertise them or sell them as such, but we can use them. That's very similar to what New Zealand did. New Zealand created an own use exemption for beekeepers because they realized that these treatments were not of risk to the environment. So somewhere between those two, I would be approaching your veterinary division, saying, hey, look at New Zealand, look at the United States. The EPA has decided that beekeepers' own use of generic products poses no unreasonable risk to the environment. So did New Zealand. So how about we do that here in Australia also? That would be what I would look. So I would pull out the law that gives the authority for regulation and make sure and look exactly how that's written and see whether you have to change the law, or in this case, we didn't even have to change the law. I just pointed out to them that they needed to follow the law.
Right. Okay. And the extended release products obviously work much better because you're getting at the mites that are under the cappings. And,
right.
And there are a lot more of those than there are the ferretic mites.
Well, there are at certain times of the year. In general, they're about the same. It's usually about 50 to 60% in the cappings. At swarm season, you got maybe up to 80%. So that changes throughout the year.
Okay, Randy, I'd like to talk to you about treatment-free beekeeping now, because initially I was rather skeptical about it. It seemed to me to be a goal too far. But more recently, the work you've done and also work that Steve Martin's done in England seems to be indicating that bees are developing natural tolerance or resistance to Varroa and beginning to coexist with it. That's actually taken us 30 years to find out, I guess. But
no,
obviously
in Africa, it took 6 years.
Yeah.
In Cuba, similar time. So it looks like 6 to 10 years in an unmanaged population.
In Europe and in America, we spent 20 years treating and not succeeding with these approaches. So how can Australia avoid spending 20 years getting it wrong and then before it starts getting it right?
Well, the thing is, if you're going to use miticides to control Varroa, the default is if nobody used any miticides, in 6 to 10 years, you'd have resistant bees. Okay, but you'd all be out of business. Yeah. So if you want to stay in business, you're going to have to control the mites. But that means that you should take on the responsibility to concurrently engage in a very strong selective breeding program. So you're still breeding, controlling the mites. So that's what we're doing. We don't lose any colonies in our breeding program to Varroa. If they need treatment, we treat them, but we don't breed off of them the next year. So no colonies need to be sacrificed for a selective breeding program. That's the bond method, and that's the bond method is extremely wasteful and very slow. You can do the selective breeding with the genetics. You want to change the genetics. Colonies need to die.
That's obviously working very successfully for you, and it's an exciting project. Somehow we need to then expand that so that we can send queens out to everybody for that 5-year period while they build up the drone populations with the same sort of genetics. Have you got something going like that in America on that sort of scale?
No, there's nothing going on in scale. One of the problems in Australia is it's going to be difficult for you to bring in genetics from out of the country. That would be the shortcut. But any bee from out of the country is going to, from most any countries, will have deformed wing virus. Now, there is an island off Africa, Stephen Martin was at, but that does not have deformed wing virus. So that would be an option possibly to bring genetic stock in that was resistant. Or the minute that deformed wing virus shows up, just bring in some resistant bees from the United States, and that would save you some years right there. Otherwise, find some isolated areas and engage in a very strong breeding program. The government, USDA, financed resistance breeding with the VSH and the POL line. And one of the things is don't release it too soon. If beekeepers want to adopt it, they need to also maintain it. So in the United States, most of the queens are produced by a number of queen producers, okay, which may be breeders or they may use somebody else's stock, but they're doing most of the queens for sale come from them. So they need to go all in on this. They can't just buy a couple of breeder queens. They think they're going to have resistant stock. That doesn't work. They need to change their whole drone pool. And so that's why this year, for the first time, we're going to be working with a large-scale producer who's good at producing bees. And I only did it under the condition that I can control the drone pool. So they gave us a large isolated mating yard that we're going to, with no other honeybees, that we're going to be able to stock with enough of our drones to control the matings. Now that way you can breed resistant stock. If you just get a resistant breeder queen, and there's no such thing as a resistant queen, it's the colony that's resistant. But getting a queen with the resistant genetics, mate them out with a bunch of non-resistant bees, you're going to wind up with non-resistant colonies.
One of the traits that we're looking for seems to be uncapping and recapping behavior, as well as
not recapping behavior. That's already there. You're looking for uncapping behavior.
Right. Well, there's an assay for the unhealthy brood odor. Do you think we should be using that as a way of targeting the colonies that we should be breeding from?
We're not really sure whether it wouldn't be a bad trait to select for, but it's not yet shown by Kyra. And I just talked to the developer just yesterday on this. It's not showing that is necessary for resistance, the best indicator for resistance. So here's the thing with my resistance. If you're going to do a selective breeding program, you have two options. You can tell the bees how to do it, or you can let them figure it out by themselves. And they may come up with different ways that you would never in your wildest dreams have thought of. I mean, would it ever have occurred to you to breed for bees that down-regulate their production of disteroids in order to prevent the mites from being able to make their eggshells completely? That's not something that would cross anybody's mind, but that was one of the ways that they do it. And different bees in different areas have developed different mechanisms that work for resistance. In general, the two main ones that we see are uncapping behavior and Varroa-sensitive hygiene, where they actually remove infested pupae. But how they put those together is a different thing. So the best I can see, and some geneticists that I really trust said, don't waste your time was selecting for specific traits. Just select for this was put out in 1999 by Harbaugh and Harris. Said just compare the rate of mite buildup in colonies, and those that mites don't build up in, no matter what the trait, how they do it, just breed from them. So then you'd have bees adapted for your area that show resistance. And it's the simplest and least expensive of all the programs. That's why I'm walking the walk with a demonstration project to see how long it would take from non-resistant stock to have resistant stock.
Okay, that's been most interesting, Randy. Do you have any other additional recommendations you could make for advice for Australian audiences?
Well, the first thing is you guys have a choice. Right now, your honey and your beeswax has a good name because it's not contaminated with synthetic miticides. So you have your choice of whether you want to maintain that or not. So once you start using synthetics, your combs are contaminated. Your beeswax is contaminated. So it no longer get a premium for organic or anything like that. On the other hand, there's no reason you have to ever use the synthetic miticide. It's totally doable to manage Varroa using nothing but the natural treatments. And it doesn't make any difference to me what you do. I don't have any personal interest in that, but it's something that you can actually look at and make a decision. And that could be at the state level, at the individual beekeeper level. Decide how you want to do it. Now, with the synthetics, you'll probably get maybe 6 years out of fluvalinate or flumethrin. You may get, if you do Coumaphos, which was a disaster, we got 3 years out of Coumaphos. Amatraz got about 20 years out of it, and it's failing all over the world. So you guys already have a crystal ball to see, what happens. The effects of the synthetic miticides, because they are lipid soluble and go into the wax, have adverse effects on the colonies. We had you can make the queens less fertile. Affects the drones. You're adding persistent chemicals in there, where the natural treatments are not persistent in the combs to the extent that the synthetics are. So you can actually have a healthier operations. So that's just a decision that you guys are going to have to make, what you want to do.
What I'm hearing is that the right way to go is going to be to use the extended release organic chemicals and go down that pathway and get busy breeding resistant bees.
Yeah, the formic acid is not an extended release. It's good for a quick knockdown. And you can use them either extended or for quick knockdown. So we use a oxalic for both a quick knockdown by the dribble method or the vaporization method, and for extended lockdown with the extended release. So it's not limiting only to one. It's understanding how each one is best used. And my first year beekeeping has charts on it that show which ones are most appropriate for which time of the season.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much for your time, Randy, and we look forward to seeing you back here in Australia again soon.
Okay.
You'll come again.
Yeah, I wish you guys luck, and I wish I could tell you that there's going to be an easy way out, but a lot of beekeepers are not going to be able to adjust quickly enough, but there will be people going out of business. And for the younger beekeepers, that means there's opportunity for you to get in. So what we're seeing here is the older generation was loath to change, and many of them retired. It's now the young generation, their kids or newbies coming in there, and they're keeping bees differently than Dad did, and they're being successful at it.
We're going to live in interesting and challenging times.
Absolutely, and opportunity times.
Good. Great. Thank you very much, Randy. Good talking to you.
Thank you.